online. So thank you very much, Thomas, for being part of the symposium. And the drill is that you have to talk about yourself, as much about the symposium. I come in and I just put that website up. And then after that, the show is yours. I come in if and when you want me to come in. So that's how it is. Please.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, Vikram, I really have to say thank you so much. And thank you for putting on this symposium, actually, which is really fantastic and really they have such a broad spread now. I think it really does a great deal to promote mediation per se. So thank you very much for that. And then, of course, thank you very much for having me on the symposium. I feel somewhat dwarfed by the stellar lineup of people that you would always present. So, but it's great to be part of, I think, what you call dispute resolution revolution. Now, I have to immediately disclose, and that's follow on from Louisa's presentation this morning. I think it was, I do not have a mediator's chicken story to tell, but I am actually quite confident that I have a mediator's mind. I will tell you in a minute why. But by trade, I'm a German and Australian lawyer, jurist, based now in the Netherlands. I practice as an independent mediator and arbitrator, and I'm accredited by the Charter Institute of Arbitrators, several panels in Europe, Asia, and Americas. And I'm also an expert arbitrator with the Court of Arbitration for Art in The Hague. So that will probably become relevant at some stage during the course of my presentation as well. I can tell you that I started about 20 years ago as a mediation advocate, I suppose you probably would call it, for government in Australia. And I continued that journey with mediation, alternative dispute resolution a few years later when I became first deputy director and then director of what's called the Secretariat of the National Dispute Resolution Advisory Council. That's an advisory body to the Australian Attorney General on alternative dispute resolution processes. And at the time, it was particularly mediation. That was the time when we introduced mandatory mediation in Australia. But there may be an even older, when I was reflecting on how to explain why I have a mediator's mind, it might be something that actually coined me much earlier. And it was perhaps a little bit subconscious, but there was a bigger influence. And I think it was my grandfather. Now, he was an old school trader and merchant here in Germany. And I remember that he occasionally got, obviously, into legal disputes, and he saw no point in litigating, just simply no point. He mentioned at the time it takes too much time, it's too expensive, all the arguments that we still have today, that we hear today, he already basically was going on about at the time. Now, he had a particular credo when it came down to these things. And I think it's very pithy and it summarizes quite well what mediation is all about. He always said a good settlement is always better than a bad judgment. And I think that really rubbed off on me. And I think that's influenced my thinking about justice. And that's why I find mediation really fascinating. So that's a little bit about me.
Perfect. So I just quickly put up that website only because because there is so much activity which keeps taking place. I don't know whether people can actually see posts, because I do understand that the basic algorithm will not show all the posts to everyone. So that's for sure. So I'll just put it up. Just to get information, because there are now more than 400 videos up there. So how do you see? So basically, we go to mediatorvikram.com. And of course, this is the lineup. I call it a lineup. This is the lineup for this symposium. It's still small in a way. Look, the thing is that the last symposium on indigenous peoples and mediation and this are kind of connected, but I divided the two only because I felt that we should not focus on the negatives of colonization when let's look at the positives of indigenous dispute resolution. So that's what it is. And of course, you can find, and I keep saying, I don't know whether you heard, I keep saying I do exist in a physical space. I do exist. It's not just an online person. So please read about the support, the World Mediation Circle, shows and events. Here is where shows and events is where the links are to the schedule. So of course, there are lots of different shows, which of course you can go through that. So basically, this is where you click and you get the YouTube links to each session. And similarly, you can get the YouTube list of the playlist of the Heart, Soul, Spirituality and Mediation. and the International Symposium on Indigenous Peoples and Mediation. So you click here, all those links are here. The World Mediators Conference, it was I think 93 sessions with about 80 panelists. So that's here. So that's, I mean, basically the information is here. There are lots of other shows. I don't know whether, Thomas, you've also got the chance to see this evolution of a mediator. And this is where we'll, of course, link up the fact that what you, in your terms of what your grandfather said, all that is in your mind, makes you who you are. So that
Yeah,
evolution
indeed.
of mediator was about that in Conversation, Beautiful Mind, lectures, talking books. I don't want to waste your time. I don't want to waste your time. There's
Oh,
lots
it's
there.
okay.
There's lots there. There are lots of things that have been happening. So that's about the show. From here onwards, like I said, it's your show. And the
Mm.
A word, I call it the A word. A word is what we don't use here. The A word is a different word, which is, I don't know whether you know what the A word is. But I'll have to tell you, the arbitration and arbitrator, we don't use it in this circle. That's the A word for me, only because I'll tell
Yeah,
you
yeah,
why. Because of the
yeah.
fact that globally, if you ask people and just talk about mediation, for some reason, they'll say arbitration. So
Mm.
I just want to totally disconnect from it, because I know institutions and everyone, mediation and everywhere gets linked. And I just want it to be considered. It's a totally standalone dispute resolution method. It has nothing to do with that process. It's a totally opposite process. That's adversarial. This is non-adversarial. So let's
Mm.
disconnect that, because I'll tell you what has happened. People have started off promoting mediation, but the money is in promoting arbitration because that's really popular. So they move to that, but the mediation word still sticks to it, but the work done is largely arbitration. So I just want to totally disconnect. So I don't hope you don't mind, but I'm wanting to disconnect the arbitration mindset of yours, bring you totally to the mediation mindset.
I think that's completely fine. I have to admit I combine the two things a little bit, but I push it to the side. That's not a problem at all. Vikram, again, thank you so much for having me today. So when I started preparing for today, I was thinking I start with an example, and I had an example, and it's actually the example why I got into art mediation in the first place, art dispute resolution in the first place, cultural object dispute resolution in the first place. But I added a second one in the preparation because past events, past couple of weeks, something grew as a conversation somewhere online in the media. And I thought there's another very nice example that we could use. So I have actually two examples to start with. Now, the first example relates to an object is reasonably old as well, as are the others, I suppose. And records suggest that it may have seen the light of day around the 11th to the 14th century in today's Andhra Pradesh. The earliest ownership of the object that we can trace is to the early 16th century as well. Now, the ownership of this object is a tale of seizures and stealing, of handing it over and taking it back, of looting. The object was claimed by Maharajas, by Islamic emperors, by emirs in India, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. So it's quite an international object, actually. In the 1800s, the Maharaja Ranjit Singh actually brought the object back to India, where it was then finally acquired by the British after the annexation of the Punjab, the result of the Anglo-Sikh Wars. Now, this was in 1849, and it was the son of the Maharaja Julip Singh, who was at the time 11 years old, who signed the annexation documents, the peace deal with the British. And a part of this peace deal, the object was surrendered to the Queen of England, and it was presented to Queen Victoria in 1950. Now, those who have a bit of an understanding of history, the wars and everything, they know that I'm talking about the Kohinoor, that famous sparkling jewel that sits actually in the crown that we also recently had very prominently displayed on the coffin of Queen Elizabeth II. It's probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous diamond in the world. It's 105 carats, it's flawless, and it's currently valued at $550 million US. But to many Indians, to many Iranians, to many Pakistani, to many Afghani, both in the past and present, this diamond has no value. It's immeasurable, its value. For them, it has been taken by the British, and its return is a matter of national identity. It's a matter of national pride, of healing still existing wounds of the past. Now, I could not independently verify whether these claims are serious or whether the newspapers just picked up on something. They certainly reported on it pretty much starting on the day after the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. And the word Kohinoor actually started trending on social media as well. So the claims are certainly around, and they have been in the past too. Would King Charles III actually consider a return? Should an official claim ever be made? I don't know. Time would tell. But if the claim would be made, we can definitely say it would be a very complex claim, a very drawn-out claim. There would be multiple claimants. I already referred to India, Afghanistan, Iran. They certainly have previously also staked out a claim in the Kohinoor. And there would be very complex legal questions surrounding this gem, including the question of immunity. Now, the second example I want to present is the Dancing Shiva. Now, this example is far less glamorous than the first one, but it is also a bit of a tale of intrigue, if I may say, and certainly ultimately of organized crime on a rather large scale. And I was involved in solving this issue, and that is the reason for my interest in this area of law or conflict and dispute, I should probably better say. Now, it goes back to 2008 when the National Gallery of Australia bought a Natarajan, or a Dancing Shiva. An artifact from this particular one was from the Hole era, in Chennai. It's about 900 years old. And the gallery paid around 5 million Australian dollars to an art dealer based in New York. That was Subhash Kapoor. Kapoor delivered, prior to the purchase, provenance documentation. And a commissioned expert looked at it, but raised concerns. He saw that it was likely, there was a likely possibility that the Shiva had been actually stolen. Still, the gallery acquired it. And I remember it being on display, and I actually saw it displayed in the museum when I lived in Canberra. So in 2011, Kapoor was arrested, incidentally, in Germany, and subsequently extradited to India. I believe he's actually still in prison there, to be honest. But when the US authorities swooped on Kapoor, they found in his possessions about $100 million worth of stolen art and cultural object. And the swoop was only possible because earlier, a gang of professional raiders employed by Kapoor had been arrested in India, and they admitted to the stealing of, among other things, this Dancing Shiva stolen in 2006 from a temple in Sriperumtham. Now, they turned on Kapoor and gave evidence against him, bringing down what I would call an empire of professional looters, of forgers, of provenance, of black market traders. And it really shone a spotlight on the murky and extremely lucrative market that artworks and cultural objects are, including stolen ones. Now, Kapoor's gallery on Fifth Avenue was called Art of the Past, and it was certainly a center of this murky world. I was involved in the case working for the government at the time, and in 2013, the matter was on the verge of being litigated. That was the natural reflex. We need to litigate this. And it was most likely litigated in New York. And my section at the time was consulted on two questions: possible damages claim, the conflict rules relating to that. And the second was the application of the UNIDROIT Convention on stolen or illegally exported cultural objects from 1995. Australia just had implemented that convention into domestic law. Now, we answered all these questions. There was no question about that, but it became to us very quickly, very clear that this is going to be a very long, a very drawn out litigation, very expensive, time-consuming and resource-intensive also for the government. And the potential for satellite litigation here, including challenges to the competency of the court, standing of parties, etc., were predictable. And that was despite really quite clear evidence that we actually had in this particular case. So my team quite early on suggested regularly, you're better off negotiating something to do with this object. And it wasn't very well received at the beginning, or had a lukewarm reception at the beginning. But at some stage in 2014, I sadly had already left the department by then, Australia and India actually commenced negotiations for the return of the Dancing Shiva. And these negotiations concluded really quickly. On the 5th of September 2014 already, the Prime Minister of Australia handed over the Dancing Shiva to the Prime Minister of India, and it subsequently was returned to the community of origin, for the community where it had been stolen. So this was a case of restitution on the one hand, so it was a return to the original owners or descendants of these owners, and it was a repatriation, it was a return to the place of origin. Now, why am I using these examples? These examples both actually show some of the traits of claims over artworks and cultural objects, the protracted history of the objects, the unclear ownership, the unclear provenance of the artwork and the cultural objects, multiple claimants involved potentially, and legal uncertainties. And the Dancing Shiva is a very good example of how negotiation, including facilitated negotiation, actually can achieve really good as well as very fast results in comparison, at least. And we look at that in a few moments. The reality, though, is this is not normal. The normal is, and I said that just before, is a reflex to go to litigation. There's the lawyers involved, they want to go to court. That's the normal way of this works. But let's take one step at a time. So as a primary proposition is that every claim is different, every dispute is different, every claim is different. And there's many varying factors when we talk about objects that were removed from their country or their community of origin, the times when the objects were taken, the circumstances in which they were taken, the stakeholders that are involved that have an interest in the object and that can shape the claim. And there's obviously, in an international setting, always several jurisdictions involved, or at least two, with different legal systems, different legal regimes that underpin all of that. So the characteristics of the claims of these disputes change. And I want to just draw out three that will always be there, that need to be considered, that are quite central to these claims. The first one is parties and stakeholders. Now, especially with respect to stolen cultural objects, it is common that not two, but multiple parties will be involved. And it's not always clear who are the parties. Do we actually deal with all the parties already? What do they actually claim? And how do they claim it? And the nature of the parties is rather diverse. They range from individual claimants, of course. They're usually previous owners or a genealogical descendant of a previous owner, a community of origin, an institution such as a museum or a foreign state. And each of these parties, potential parties, has its own characteristics that we need to consider. Individual claimants, so often questions that relate to the proof of the ownership. For institutions such as museums, it's very often the accession. They can be prohibited by legislation. For example, in the UK, we just had a law until very recently that actually did that, although that was now somewhat loosened a little bit through the new Charities Act in the UK. And questions of state immunity that can arise in these matters, because when states or state institutions, such as some of the museums, are involved, then questions of immunity do come to the fore. The parties could also be claimants that are coordinated as a group. They could also be completely disconnected. They could be representatives of groups. They could claim to be representatives, are actually not really representative, but claim to be representatives. They could be supported by others who are not involved in the claim. So there's various permutations of how these parties actually are constituted. And the result of this can be different claims against the same object, some earlier, some later, some in different languages, some based on different arguments, as to the cultural relevance of the object often. And sometimes you even find that they are placed in a different origin altogether. So that was a little bit what I was alluding to with the Kohinoor, because it's actually not 100% sure where the Kohinoor was found. There may be multiple competing claims as a result, and some parties may even challenge the claims made by the other competing parties. Now, moreover, in addition to the parties, there can also be stakeholders, so that the people not involved in the actual litigation or the actual claim, but they support maybe the claim, or they, without being a party, seek to influence the public debate around the claim. Or they have competing interests, such as tax authorities, for example, when objects are bought under governmental tax schemes. Or they are the donor of a cultural object to a museum, and they want to know what will happen to it, or even be heard in that regard, but they don't want to be obviously a party to the claim. So it's easy to appreciate that this can evolve into some form of spaghetti bowl, if I may call it that way, which is very difficult to manage. It's very complex to manage, in particular for courts, and it can result in very, very considerable satellite litigation to work out competency, but also standing. Now, the second characteristic I want to draw on is provenance. So provenance is, let's call it the thumbprint of an object. It's about a record of ownership that can be used both as a guide to authenticity, but also a guide to the quality of the object. It's actually the value in the end, because if the provenance is there, the provenance is right, then the value comes with it. Now, provenance usually requires considerable research into the history of the object, the place of origin, the chain of ownership. Now, questions such as how was the object acquired in the first place and from whom, they become relevant here. Did the previous owner actually own the object? Was it on a database of stolen objects, such as the one maintained by the UNESCO? Was it on the ICOM Red List that is relevant for museums? Not all of these questions are actually easily answered. And often research into provenance requires consultation, broad consultation, with states and communities of origin, diaspora groups, museums, donors, sellers, and of course, experts that are consulted on the quality of the object. So there's usually a lack of direct evidence that we see in these claims, and the evidence that is there is often contradicted. So much is found circumstantially, also due to an affluction of time, and the stories surrounding the object not only compete for prominence, but are often interwoven with folklore and legend, and they're therefore not necessarily suitable as cogent evidence, compelling evidence for court proceedings. So establish provenance, while fundamental, is extraordinarily difficult to do. The third issue I want to briefly tackle is the length and the cost of the claims. Now, we know from art claims in particular, but it applies to cultural objects as well, that these claims can be in court for years. Very famous, very infamous examples perhaps here is Adele Blocher I, The Woman in Gold by Klimt. 8 years in court, plus 2 years in binding arbitration, a total of 10 years to resolve. The Welfenschatz is a German treasure that is disputed at the moment. The ownership is disputed. Was in court from 2014 and was just 2 or 3 weeks ago a presumably final judgment of a court in the United States was handed down. So that's also 8 years. And the cake really is taken here by a painting by Pizarro, Rue Saint-Honoré, that is a case, Cassira and Bornemissa, that was 17 years in the courts now. So there are several reasons for that. Now, on the one hand, the value of these objects can be staggering. Just using these 3 examples before, Klimt is valued or was valued at the time when the case was resolved at around 140 million euros, making it the most expensive painting at the time. The Welfenschatz is estimated at the moment at 100 million, although the heirs are claiming it's 260 million. Pizarro, it's a very small painting. It's not actually very big, 65 million. So we see already there's really big money involved in all of that. It's possible for the claimants to use multiple avenues for their claims as well as multiple jurisdictions to do this. And the options to commence parallel proceedings actually exist. Courts usually must consider their competency. That's always a big challenge in these proceedings, And the standing of the parties is also a question, as well as whether immunities do apply. That results, as I said before, in considerable satellite litigation that must be fought through various instances, adding to, you know, layer after layer after layer of time to it. And the claims themselves are extremely positional already. The parties have their hardened position. The claims are cast in legal terms by the lawyers. The legal adversarial arguments that are constructed, arguing over the right and wrong, the rights and obligations, and the entitlements in each individual case. So what we see in litigation is that the parties usually do not speak the same legal languages. They have different legal languages. They regularly lack an understanding and also the acceptance of the other side's situation, its circumstances, and its interest. Now, one thing that we do know in law is any length of time and every added complexity translates into increased costs. That's a given fact. And the longer a claim takes, the more complex issues arise, the higher the costs associated with it will be. And we can actually distinguish here two types of costs. There is, on the one hand, the financial costs for the claims. Now, I can't put complete figures on it, because obviously they're not freely available. But when we break it down, lawyers, and it's rumored that the lawyer in the Klimt case received more than $20 million on a contingency fee basis. Experts, I found expert rates in excess of $1,500 an hour. Scientific studies like chronology, multispectral imaging, etc., all cost money. Translations, notarizations, storage, handling, maybe travel and air freight, insurances for the object. All of that adds up sometimes, I guess, to more than tens of millions or to tens of millions of dollars or euros. The second cost involved is an emotional cost. Now, many of the looted objects have high spiritual, religious, or other cultural values for the state and community of origin. They embody a collective memory of people, the people who created it, who worshipped it, who valued it. These objects are highly symbolic, and the removal of these objects leaves behind deep and ongoing emotional trauma and scars. And some of the spiritual and religious objects are very private. Thus, to see them on display in a showpiece in a foreign museum adds to the emotional pain. Claims through the courts will mean usually adversarial confrontations with this loss, reliving the loss and the reliving of the enduring pain. And it can be very draining both on the people and the communities. Now, I just wanted to give sort of a bit of an overview where we're actually at when we litigate these kinds of things. And we've seen now that there can be very complex, very financially and emotionally draining claims for the return of objects. Now, the positions are often entrenched and hardened. The courts can help, but it's a determination on the basis of law, and the progress can be difficult and costly. What are the alternatives? Now, I wanted to say a few words about the A word, but I leave the A word out because it too is a process, I completely agree, that is an against each other, like litigation. It's not a with each other. And so it can only be always a last resort, if anything. And the first resort for me is mediation. So mediation in the art and cultural object sector, whether it is stolen art as the Dancing Shiva that I referred to beforehand, or whether it is a looted object as the Axum stele that was taken by Italy from Ethiopia in 1937, and to which I will come back later on, fits into an emerging trend that promotes the transition from dispute resolution methods that are adversarial, rigid, combative, rights and obligations based, towards processes that are more collaborative, agile, creative, and interest and needs based. Now, I speak of an emerging trend here because the importance and the value of mediation in the context of the return of art and cultural objects becomes clearer every day. And this was again acknowledged at this 22nd session of the Intergovernmental Committee for the return of cultural property to its countries of origin or its restitution in case of illicit appropriation. And this meeting actually, incidentally, took place exactly today, 1 year ago. So this committee has, since 2005, the function of mediation as well as a conciliation, but I leave that to the side as well, added to its mandate. So that means that a claim for the return of the cultural object, insofar as it comes within the material scope of the committee, can be dealt with within the committee's framework for mediation and conciliation. But I don't wish to delve into the work of the committee. That's really not the point, because it actually only concentrates on resolution of claims amongst UNESCO member states and associated members. There are quite a few of them, but that's not all of them. And my presentation has a broader scope, because we will be talking, or I will be not distinguishing between states or individuals bringing a claim, but I will actually focus on the process of mediation. So let me point out 4 aspects of mediation, this party-controlled, this interest and needs-based process that I personally think are particularly valuable in the context of the return of cultural objects that had been looted as part of colonial rulership. So there is, in the very first place, the mediator. Now, the mediator, and that goes without a saying, assumes obviously a very pivotal role within the mediation, facilitates the process, but does not take away the control from the parties, has no decision-making power and no authority over the parties. So far, so good. But he or she assumes what I would describe as a significant responsibility for the mediation procedure itself. And herein lies the great advantage of mediation, even over plain negotiation between the parties. By involving a mediator, the parties interleave in their disputes a person that takes responsibility for the procedure, as I just said, who designs a process that allows the parties to explore the details of their dispute and their interests and their needs. It allows them to negotiate comprehensively and openly, including by proposing, developing, discarding options, suggestions, solutions for the resolution of their dispute. The mediator uses specific skills, trained skills, to encourage free and frank conversations, moves the parties along without rushing them, keeps track of issues, may suggest delving deeper into possible solutions, but also calls, obviously, for private meetings, the caucuses, at appropriate times. By retaining the service of an experienced, skilled mediators in these return cases, the parties, in my view, simply significantly increase their chances of reaching creative, perhaps even innovative solutions to their issue, because the mediator devises for and with the parties the best possible framework within which they can resolve their own dispute, working with them to develop a sound, resilient, possibly even sustainable and lasting solution that ends the dispute effectively. The second element is confidentiality, one of the key principles of mediation, encompassing both the mediation itself, but also the information imparted and shared in the course of the mediation. The confidentiality is sometimes, in some jurisdictions nowadays, flanked by legislation, but not always. And in any event, it is always something that is also consensual between the party, because every mediation agreement actually has a confidentiality clause in it. Therefore, the parties can adjust the scope of the confidentiality. And this is very helpful in relation to return claims. And let me tell you why. Because often return claims do require, even if they're between even private parties, engagement with the political processes, with stakeholders, and even with the public at large. So, for example, parties could adjust the confidentiality that applies to their mediation by agreeing to include certain stakeholders that have an interest in the claim without them being a party. Not for the full mediation, but maybe for parts of it. Involve the machinery of government if necessary. Engage in public consultation when necessary. Set the timing when to engage with government stakeholders or the public, and coordinate the release of information, for example, through agreed media releases to inform stakeholders and the public of progress and of the outcome of the mediation. And being able to adjust the scope of the mediation in that way can be an important way to ensure transparency in these return claims, while maintaining an appropriate degree of confidentiality for the parties. And balancing this confidentiality with transparency can lead to better acceptance of mediated outcomes through government, through stakeholders, as well as the public. This is also a very good example for the flexibility of the mediation process itself, of which I will not go any further and any deeper, but the fact that the parties can actually adjust their confidentiality, the scope of the confidentiality, is also testament to the flexibility of the process itself. The final point I want to make is, or want to look at, is the creativity, as I call it, of the mediation process. The scope of this creativity when developing and ultimately also agreeing on solutions concerning the return of cultural object is, in my view, best shown by just using some examples. And I focus on two, there's plenty more, but I just want to use these two because they're actually quite axiomatic in a way. The first one, and I referred to it already, concerns a stele that's it's not an obelisk because it doesn't have a pyramidical tip, but it's a long stone pillar, if I may call it that way, a stele. Now, the Axum stele is an Ethiopian national monument, and it stands tall in today's Tigray province. That's a province, unfortunately, in the news for all the wrong reasons at the moment. It was carved in the 3rd century by King Azana, and it remained in situ there until Italian occupation of Ethiopia ended in 1937. Sadly, with widespread looting, and the stele was cut into 3 pieces and was transported to Rome, and it was put up there in Porta Capena. That's a square very close to Circus Maximus. Already in 1947, so this is only 10 years later, Ethiopia and Italy reached an agreement to return this stele. But it took until 1997, so 50 years, until when Italy finally prepared for the return of the stele. And it took another 8 years until 2005, and an upgrade to the airport in Axum to accommodate large transport planes to bring the stele down there, that the stele was actually returned. And it was erected in 2008 and unveiled, and it's now there in the Northern Stele Park of Axum. So that's the story of its taking and its return. But what's interesting for us, and where the creativity comes in, is in the solution, because the solution, the return agreement, actually has a cooperation agreement included between the Ethiopian Archaeological Services and Italian universities. And at the heart of this cooperation is research, collaborative archaeological excavations, as well as the promotion of Axum as a World Heritage Site. Now, coupling the return with the promise of collaboration between universities and archaeological services, for example, can be a really powerful, really creative result, satisfying the interests of all involved. Where this also has been done, but on a much broader footing, is the so-called Utimut. That's the return program for artifacts agreed between Denmark and Greenland. Now, the program was the result of increasing moves towards independence of Greenland from Denmark, and initial calls for the return of thousands of artifacts that were in Denmark were basically fell on deaf ears. It was until the 1960s that Denmark took the position that Greenland just simply had no adequate facilities to safely display and store these artifacts. So they would better remain in Denmark's National Museum's Arctic exhibition. Now, that's an argument that we hear actually very frequently. You can simply not guarantee that these artifacts are stored safely and appropriately. Moreover, Denmark also said that Danish law would prevent a return because it placed the so-called antiquarian responsibility, so the maintenance to ensure that these artifacts do not decay, with Denmark. By the 1970s, Denmark had built a modern museum then and started negotiating again with Denmark on the return of the artifacts, as well as what's called a home rule government. That's a further step towards independence. And it took some time to cast this agreement, but in 1979, it entered into force. Now, there was a couple of really interesting things here. The first is that it too established a collaborative regime, but this time not between the two states or between Greenland and Denmark, but between the two national museums. And it also created a rule that said that newly discovered artifacts would remain in Greenland. So the antiquarian responsibility for newly discovered artifacts would lie with Greenland, while the old artifacts in Denmark would remain with Denmark. However, items of cultural historic value were to be returned to Greenland gradually. And with that gradual transfer, also the antiquarian responsibility would be drawn down further and further. So there were legislative changes involved. Now, the first returning objects included watercolors, and there was a subsequent agreement made. And again, here we see how the parties agreed on something that actually suited them both. The first one was agreement that there would be a photographic reproductions of these watercolors for exhibition in Denmark in the National Museum. The second is that the exhibition of the originals would take place in various Danish museums prior to the repatriation to Greenland, also to raise awareness of the repatriation of these watercolors. And finally, there was a payment of a symbolic price for this collection as well. But that was not the end of the collaboration, because it's actually an organically growing collaboration. And by 1983, we see that the collaboration expanded and was validated through a non-political committee that headed the repatriations by then. It monitored repatriations, it worked out principles for the return, and it proposed even the return of specific objects. So over time, the collaboration efforts were further expanded. They comprised research. They comprised collaboration on archaeological sites between Danish and Greenlandic experts. And there is a scholarship program for Greenlandics who wish to study archaeology in Denmark. So the result we can probably describe quite well as a form of cultural partnership that benefits both parties. And the museum both museums boast today the finest Arctic collections in the world. There's two remarks that I want to make. The first one is, I completely agree these are the results of negotiations, not facilitated negotiations. They were not mediations, but this would translate easily into a facilitated negotiation context that could also be easily achieved in a mediation without any problems whatsoever. But the second comment is a little bit more interesting because it actually shows something that is very unique to mediations. The level of creativity we can see here, the level of creativity in the solutions that were achieved cannot be achieved in litigation. And that is because litigation and the outcome of litigations, the decisions of courts, are confined by the law, offering only the remedies that will be available under the law at any given time. The mediation, though, allows the parties to explore the full issues between them, find and agree on creative solutions tailored to the very situation, to the circumstances that can satisfy the interests of everyone involved. And that does not, or is not limited only to solutions that are permissible under law. It can actually be much broader. the classic example is the expression of regret or the apology that could, for example, be agreed, which is something a court could not order. Let me just make some concluding remarks at this particular point in time. So have we seen claims for the return of cultural objects to their state or community of origin or their rightful owners can be very complex. There can be multiple parties, there can be multiple claims, multiple stakeholders, all adds to the complexity of these cases. The difficulties to establish provenance and with that appropriately cogent and probative evidence for court proceedings further add to the complexity. Now, leaving to one side the often quite difficult substantive legal issues that come with these return cases as well, the complexities that we have identified translate into extensive and often protracted legal proceedings that are rife with satellite disputes on the competency of the court, the standing of parties and stakeholders, etc. Talked about that. Mediation offers here a very clear alternative, transforming these legal claims that are adversarial, that are combative, rights and obligation based, I think I said as well, into more collaborative, more creative, interest-based, needs-based processes. And the advantages are clear for those that are involved in it, and focus on interests and needs as opposed to entitlements, rights, obligations. There's that flexibility I was talking about, leading to party-designed, optimized procedures for the efficient and the effective resolution of the claim. There's a significantly reduced cost, both financially and emotionally, because these negotiations are quicker. I was referring to the negotiations between Australia and India. That negotiation took less than a year. I was looking up the return of the Benin bronze from Germany to Niger. Again, it was a negotiation that was approximately a year long, not the 8, 10, 17 years that we see these things percolating through the court. So for me, mediation offers considerable advantages and should be really the first resort for any parties involved in discussions surrounding the return of cultural objects, whether they have been handed over or taken, whether they have been looted or stolen in a colonial or non-colonial context. That's really, irrelevant for the purposes of me advocating for mediation in this context. Retaining the services of an experienced mediator that can make really a huge difference, because the parties have simply a better chance of developing sound, resilient, sustainable solutions that end the dispute effectively between the parties. And it can preserve the relationship between the party, of course, creating a solid platform that can be the beginning and not the end of productive, intensifying relationships between the parties in the future. I leave it here. I thank you very much and welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Thomas. Interesting area, which of course connected to colonization. We'll just look at it from that perspective. Call it loot or whatever. Let's not categorize it because we don't really want to do that. But what are the challenges? I mean, why would mediation not take place? What would be the arguments against it? Have you considered that, or you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, I think I alluded to the fact that I think the classic, almost a reflex is we go to court. Whether it is to claim it, whether it is to defend the claim, I think that's really still very much at the forefront. It's don't know whether it's exactly only because the lawyers get involved. Of course, the lawyers going to litigation is their trade still. It's not necessarily mediation, but certainly I think it's not helping to go and see a lawyer first. I think that's one big issue. The other big issue is, of course, the involvement of states. And if you try to claim something from a state, then in the state itself, the immediate response to that, reaction to that is, but you cannot claim that because we're immune from suit. And this immunity is not necessarily something that is an issue for mediation, but that would actually be determined ultimately by courts. So there you would have again this natural reaction to go to a court and say, sorry, but we're resisting this claim on the basis of immunity. Personally, I think nothing in the world would block a state from going down the path of negotiating with a party. That's not a question of immunity. For me, that's actually two parties collaborating with each other. Immunity is a very legal concept that doesn't necessarily have to enter the mediation. The mediation will take place in the shadow of the law, as Eidmüller calls it, but these concepts, these legal concepts, do not necessarily enter, and there will be ultimately always be a solution that will take care of the interests of the parties, including this interest of taking note of this interest of immunity. There's no question about that.
Because actually, Thomas, the connection there is actually governments themselves getting into a mediation in general. Let's not, of course, art is one aspect of it. I think in general, that area needs to be looked at. How can you give comfort to a government that yes, you get into a mediation and you get into a settlement, and how will that settlement be looked at in the country? And because if in the art case there will be emotions on the other end, so is the government looking at it from the perspective the court decided, so we had to do this, or this came up from that. So I mean, we just have to look at it one on the art perspective, and in general mediation where the government is involved.
Governments and mediations is a very, very fascinating topic. I see it on the investment side where you have governments involved. Governments are not necessarily well set up, still not, for actually going into mediations, in particular this kind of mediation. That's why I was talking about the parties and also the stakeholders and stakeholder involvement, because very often when governments are involved, the issue of stakeholder becomes actually a really relevant issue, a really important issue. And very often governments say, like, well, we have to do stakeholder consultations, or we need to involve these people, and we need to consult. And there is nothing in principle in a mediation that would actually stop that from happening, because the parties can very well negotiate with each other, guided perhaps by the mediator in a way, to work out ways in which you either bring in these stakeholders or you actually inform, because that's the other element to it, informing, for example, political processes. There are, of course, situations where a government might need to agree to something by a cabinet decision. Now, obviously, if you insist on mediation being completely confidential, then the government would not be able to go to cabinet with anything. But the parties can agree on a common agreed document that then can actually be submitted into the cabinet process. I don't think that there would be a problem with that. And as long as it's consensual between the parties, what has been reduced into writing for this purpose and for this process, then it's actually possible. So again, it is possible, I think, for governments to be part of it. It is difficult because they're not yet always set up for these kinds of mediations, and then also obviously following through. And I agree with you. I still hear this quite regularly. It's easier, I think, for a government to ultimately say, wouldn't be our choice, but we were ordered to do that by a court or by the A-word, by the appellate tribunal. We were ordered to do that, as opposed to, well, we agreed to that. They're opening. There's at least a perception that you open yourself up more readily and more easily to criticism if you were responsible for the outcome, as opposed to being told what the outcome actually is. Yes.
Yeah. Well, in this case, I'm still moving away from the A word, because for governments that will also be difficult, because why did you agree to go into that? So I think courts will be what they're looking at, because I think the general thing that comes up, I mean, of course, we want to focus on this topic that you were talking about, but it is connected, that corruption is one thing, that allegation is something that governments do not want. And because you're settling something, and settlement is discretion, and do you want to take it upon your head? Look, I am really interested to find a solution to how governments can get into mediation. So I'm taking this further because I really think that in a country like ours, where the government is the biggest litigant, if we can work a framework out where the government gets into a mediation, but still the allegation of corruption can be in some way looked at so that they are not falling into that trap. I'm talking about a bureaucrat, even down to an officer level at the lowest level. Would he want to stick his neck out, or her neck out, whatever gender? Would they want to stick their neck out? So I think that is why I'm just going on about it, only because I'm thinking that Thomas might have something in his mind as to how we can get over this. In general, we'll look at it, the art part of it also, but in general, is there anything that you've looked at on this?
Yeah, I think my natural reaction to that would be, Vikram, how much time do we have? Because this is a very new. I mean, this is a whole. I mean, you probably could do an entire symposium on that, and I would be more than happy to come back for this. To be very honest, I'm writing at the moment with a Brazilian colleague, actually, a paper on the issue of corruption and mediation, because I actually think that there's a bit more to this than what we have at the moment, where people basically say, "Oh, it's not really an issue." I think it's actually a fundamental issue. I think it's a big issue. It will be a big issue at some stage. I think the Singapore Convention will shed some light on that. I think there will be a bit of a spotlight on the topic soon, because it is an issue in the proceedings themselves, but it's also at the enforcement stage later on an issue. And there are questions, indeed, as you just said, well, is it really something a government official would put their name to it? No, some jurisdictions it's actually not permitted. It's a criminal offense. They cannot do that. In others, they need special authorization from that. That's why I said, cabinet processes would maybe be necessary because cabinet needs to agree to a particular outcome. There are really questions around, you agreed to that, but on what terms did you agree to it? This is a question of transparency, ultimately, as far as I'm concerned. Can you really look behind the veil? The more trustworthy you are, the more transparent you are about the process. I think the better it is. But you cannot be so transparent that everything is really out in the open. I think that doesn't work. Are there mechanisms to overcome that? I can only repeat. Mechanisms to increase the transparency is certainly one very important way. It may require within jurisdictions who want to do this also to change legislative frameworks within the jurisdictions to enable governments to more readily participate in mediations, for example, by creating areas within government where people have special training on the one hand, but also special authority on the other hand to actually engage in mediations for governments. That needs to be also very transparent, that they can do that and on what terms maybe they can negotiate and engage. There are sort of some ideas that are floating around in my brain at the moment, but certainly not yet completely thought through and thought out. There's more to it, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you how I'm looking at it is that maybe it has to be a two-step process. One is it's not a mediation, but the role of a mediator to bring in the stakeholders on a consensus building or a discussion thing. So it's not called a mediation, so you're not looking at it from that perspective. So maybe because look, emotions is something which you have to take care of, definitely, which is what is going to be a concern for the government. Basically, the political aspect of it is definitely going to come up. So I'm just thinking, can we do that? And this, again, I'm saying not only for these kind of disputes. In general, there are a lot of disputes which, of course, affect the country as a whole. So the role of mediators to come in to create that kind of discussion, to bring in stakeholders, facilitate a conversation, and maybe to reach one step further up on the process. And then when that environment has been created, then take it into a formal process. Maybe I'm just looking at that. Maybe that could be one way of going about it. I don't know what you think of that.
I think that's very good. I mean, by the end of the day, look, I don't want to call it semantics because, what do you call it? I mean, if it, in Australia, we always say, if it quacks like a duck, it looks like a duck, chances are it is a duck. So, the same thing is if you have the core characteristics of a mediation, call it a mediation. I completely agree. I think together with the mediator, the parties could devise a process very, very easily to bring in stakeholders at appropriate times for oral conversations, etc. Not a problem at all. I think that's certainly something that is proposed in the area of investment mediation. That's certainly one area where this is done, but also in complex disputes, in complex mediations, where you really need several preliminary meetings, including with the parties, to map out the various issues that need to be discussed, that you also map out a path forward that include at appropriate times the bringing in of even experts, stakeholders, the government machinery, as I called it beforehand. That can all be done with an experienced mediator well in advance, giving clarity to the parties as to how the roadmap ahead is for them. Also, the issues that they need to consider at any given step in the process in terms of who's coming in from the outside now, how do we need to prepare for that, what can we actually share, etc. Sounds to me very good. I think that's probably exactly the way. And then maybe then you call that something different, and then at the end you have after you've done all this groundwork, including bringing in the stakeholders, then you start the actual mediation between the parties, if it's more than two in particular, that you then call mediation proper. That's entirely possible, of course. Yes. But this would be just a mediation, a complex mediation, where you have all these, preliminary steps. But what you call it by the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Yeah.
Because why terminology makes a difference. I'll give you another example, which I should have told you earlier, that I moved away, and because of the last conference, moved away from the terminology parties to participants. Because terminology makes a difference, because you've already created an adversarial process or adversarial environment. So terminology in that sense makes a difference from that perspective. So participants, same thing when you use the word mediation, there is a certain outcome in relation to a settlement that you're looking for. And then the question comes in, is this person, should that person be participating in an activity which can lead to a settlement? What locus does this person have? And if you change the terminology to consensus building or whatever other word, I'm not fixed on any word as such, but if you take that question goes away. So you're bringing in a lot of more people without someone questioning their locus, and that will then get and I'm saying transparency should be total. Why? There is nothing confidential about this aspect when something which relates to the countries involved. I mean, you can involve people on a much larger level, which I've been saying, get them all, be watching it on YouTube and bringing their thoughts in. Where's the issue? Because look, this is where I'll connect colonization. That the whole idea was keep it between a set of people, and the colonizer chooses who those people are. So create that class distinction that you are invited to the table, you are not. Making this person feel, oh, yes, I'm important. And that's how the colonizer functions. That's the only way, divide and rule in this aspect also. So we have to broad base the participants in that. And I think because confidentiality, of course, I mean, that's another debate. Like you said, that one symposium on governments, one on confidentiality, that by itself is a debate whether it is confidential or not in places like that. So definitely. So in terms of time, I never have a problem on time because I keep enough time. It's only been 4 hours since I've been sitting here. That's all. I can go on. That's not a problem. But I have to value your time. I have to value your time. So
it's perfect time in the afternoon now, so I can continue. That's no problem at all.
Yeah,
if I could just come back, I found your your comment concerning confidentiality actually very interesting, because you do see still also in these negotiations that the negotiations are actually totally confidential. Even their existence is confidential. And I sometimes don't understand that. There should be not really too much sensitive issues, actually. I mean, certainly not in terms of the existence. Maybe there are parts of it where some more sensitive material is exchanged between the parties, information is exchanged between the parties, but then you can ring fence this off. That's I think the flexibility of the process would actually permit that. But other than that, it's not really a reason why the whole thing needs to be completely confidential. Within the process later on, I think within the negotiations, that's a different issue. But in particular, if you were dividing it or not separating it out, but if you classify the two elements that we just talked about, the consensus building and then perhaps later on an actual mediation to it, I think then probably you would have greater scope for actually not being so confidential, but actually enlarging the transparency. And I think that would go a very long way of ensuring also better buy-in from the public by the end of the day processes. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. That's I think the major key to it, because acceptance to the entire end result will be lots more if there has been some involvement on a larger level on that. I think and this is again the same thing on lots of issues, a lot of national issues which come up, and with the fact that the whole politics and advocacy and activism is happening on one end. You need to balance it out on this end where people can get involved. Otherwise, what happens is they feel part of that because it's a movement on the other end. They don't feel part of this because these are closed room discussions. So they don't think they don't know, because look, there is definitely going to be suspicion on the intent of people in relation to the government, because there is going to be the other side. So to be able to be transparent, I think, again, I'm saying this is a move away from colonization, that transparency, people's government, people's treasure, national treasure is people's treasure. So let's get the people involved. This is a mindset. I think it's a mindset that needs to change. Around it, then the structure will change. The whole thing will change. It starts from that very key thing that we are going to do this. It is us as some way privileged people who can get into these discussions, and people don't need to be part of it. I think we need to change that, I think.
Mindset is so fundamental in this, both in a way from moving away from this conservative approach, if I may call it that way, that is litigation, to a really this collaborative consensus building. I like that word actually very much in this context. That actually then ultimately sees these creative solutions that we actually do have. I mean, that's really the nice thing, and it obfuscates somewhat the discussion around, you can't have it back because you don't have the facilities to do that, to take it back. Well, maybe the conversation should not be that, but the conversation would be, how can we help you to create something that actually can house it, so we can return it into a safe environment so that it's there for posterity, for the global community to see, but it's in original context. Because that's also very often, obviously, with these artifacts, they're ripped out of their context. There's not only religious items that are removed from their communities, but they're also ripped out of their historical context, out of their geographical context. And by returning them to their geographical context, to their historical context, the object actually gains far more meaning than being somewhere in a Western, utilitarian, very sort of, I don't know, modern, glass and steel museum where, they sort of look fancy, but somewhat out of place. That's really, I think, one way of looking at it as well. Absolutely.
But Thomas, there's actually a documentary on Discovery on the Kohinoor. It's a very interesting story. The Kohinoor story is really interesting, and where the stone started from, I think it was 680 carats, and how then it is come down to its form as it is. So interesting. Please, if you haven't watched it, please watch it. It's really.
I read about it actually. So I read in the preparation. I read about the Kohinoor because I was totally intrigued that this cropped up all of a sudden. I didn't even realize that there was a big discussion about it. But in the context of reading up on the Kohinoor, its history and so forth, I noticed that there was a documentary that was made about it, and I haven't found it on my streaming services yet, but maybe it's on YouTube somewhere. So let's have a look.
It's on. Yeah, here we watch it on Discovery. I mean, I watched it on Discovery here.
Oh, okay, so it's on Discovery Channel. We don't have that, so we'll see. Maybe.
Yeah. So I mean, these are interesting stories, and definitely there's a lot of history to them. So to be able to get down to actually who is, like you said, who is actually who are the people, who are the stakeholders, which country is going to raise claims on it, because it's come out. I mean, I also did not know so much about it. After I watched that, I understood there's lots happening here. The movement of it in India, then moving out and coming back, who's looting. I mean, finally, look, loot is also a word which is, some people will use it as loot, some will say it's a rightful claim, whatever. I mean, it's like one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter kind of thing. So it's a lot of, I think, a lot of areas there which we will need lots of discussions. But the important thing is, like you're saying, that mediation is an option which should be considered and explored, and if there are challenges to it, let's look at how we can remove those and take it as a process in general and for the arts.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a strong believer it's actually the first resort. It's the first and almost the only resort that there should be. Yeah, it is mediation is, I think, for me, the most suitable process for these claims.
No, that's interesting. I mean, that's something that needs to be explored. I don't know how much, where we have reached otherwise. Of course, these are, I mean, sensitive, and of course, they have lots more history to it. But otherwise, in the arts, I mean, in general, have you seen it working, and how's it been working in other?
Yeah, it is certainly working. It's I mean, you see the amount of returns at the moment. I mean, it becomes more and more. You know, there's I don't want to say necessarily claims, but it's certainly governments are talking quite a bit about the return of art objects, of cultural objects. We see it here in Germany very strong at the moment. I think Europe in general is quite active on that front by now returning things. I read a staggering figure: 95% of cultural objects are not in Africa anymore, but actually are taken out of Africa and are dispersed worldwide. So there's a great potential, you know, for returning these items that were initially taken from there. And I think for me, mediation can make really a very, very big contribution to that, ranging from simply returning the object, creating collaborations between states, between amongst museums, donors, etc., right through to also healing. I think there's a lot of pain still out there because objects have been taken from societies, from communities, and there's, I think, also the opportunity to use mediation as a tool to create some healing in this regard. You know, people get heard, people not hurt, but heard in the process. They can contribute to the process, they can shape the solutions, and they can ultimately also see the objects coming back. And I think that's a very, very good outcome if that can be achieved indeed.
Because I think the little difference in what otherwise the mediation that takes place, and this will be that in this case, participants that are what you see as participants might not just be the people, like you said, there will be other stakeholders, and the mediator to be able to expand that rather than normally, okay, you will get in experts, yes, you will bring in a mediator, can look at that, but here the participants itself, the mediator is looking at, oh, let's bring this person in, and to be able to, in whatever way, these participants to understand, and for them to involve them into it, maybe a mediator might have to play a little larger, a little different role there, I mean, than the traditional mediator.
Yeah, but as I said, it's actually not uncommon in complex commercial mediations to have that role as a mediator, no? To really be also, you know, conducting the process a little bit more hands-on, if I just describe it that way. That's actually not completely unknown, and when you actually look also at how investment mediations and investor state mediations unfold now, when they are conducted, then you know, you also have this not a more active role of the mediator per se, but it's just the shaping of the process is certainly at the beginning much more on the forefront of the minds of all involved, the participants, together with the mediator, and they shape the process to the needs of the parties. And you know, that's not uncommon, I would have thought, in mediations. And these ones here are complex mediations. So from that point of view, again, with multiple participants, stakeholders, etc. And so, you know, you would have to go through a similar process, devise a similar process, but it will change from mediation to mediation because every claim will be different. The amount of stakeholders, the amount of participants will change, and that will change the dynamic within the mediation too.
But I'm just thinking that Thomas wanted to shy away from saying hands-on. I am saying it is something that needs to be done, because definitely in some parts of the world, it is, oh, this is someone who's just is a facilitator and not go beyond that, which I'm of the view that I think it's a very limiting aspect of mediation. When it has to be hands-on, it has to be hands-on, get more involved, it needs to be more involved, plays an active role, yeah, needs to play an active role. I think this whole categorization into different aspects of mediation is, for the user, is very confusing, and that's the worst part that's happening with mediation. The user doesn't understand all these differences. The person has come, help me resolve this dispute, so help the person resolve the dispute rather than getting it.
Yeah, sorry, you know, I completely agree with you, and I think in you know, in particular in the area of process, how do we take this forward? How do we map out how we want to go about that? I think there is, for a mediator, definitely a role to play that is, you know, facilitative in one way, but you know, with, you know, drawing maybe also on experience on how things work or not work, helping the parties to understand, if you want to do this, then we need to also look at that, or so forth. I think that's actually something that mediators, certainly on the process side, can do, and I wouldn't have a problem with that. Yeah, but I know that's why I was, yeah, you picked up correctly that I was a little bit hesitant to say more hands-on, because I know that there is this, it's this big debate always about how hands-on should a mediator be.
Yeah. So, but look, let me tell you, I will connect this to colonization. This is another way, another colonization of mediation, which is happening, which maybe starts in some part of the world, that facilitative is the only way. Anything beyond that is not mediation. Some start. So then that gets taken into other parts of the world. Into parts of the world where traditionally they will be more accepting of an evaluative role of the mediator. But you say, no, that's not mediation. So what you're doing is you're moving them away from a certain aspect of mediation, which they're comfortable with, which is part of their culture. No, what you are doing is not mediation. What we are telling you is mediation. So it's a colonization of mediation. The other aspect which you might have heard me talk about, which in that sense I don't want to get into, but I'll just quickly just talk about this aspect, that qualification, certification, making you the mediator, and you are inferior when you don't have that. So traditionally we have people in every village, everywhere, who are doing it, but no, you are not mediators. The people that we say are the mediators, which we certify, those are mediators. And I'm not talking about governments or whatever, I'm saying institutions or whatever. So you're creating that class distinction, which is another colonization. For me, that's colonization of mediation. So I'm trying to fight that on one end, because for me, the numbers are huge on the other end. And you will never, this certification and all is confined to certain institutions, a certain type of mediation happening where numbers are not there. Millions on this side, hundreds, maybe thousands on the other end. I was giving the example of yesterday, just before this, I mean, before Amando's session, there was Gunavati. Singapore Mediation Center put out his figures, 5,200 since 1997. 25 years, 5,200. We file 18 million cases in courts every year. The US files 100 million every year. So when you read 5,200 and you say, what are you talking about? So I think we're just getting lost of mediation part of that world. I think we just have to move away on larger level. No, I'm not saying, Thomas, you are part of that. I'm just saying from my end that to take it down to the village. I'm saying to bring it there, we might have to move away from the institutionalizing of mediation, which is happening. So that's on the colonization. I just wanted to connect it to colonization, but you might have to unmute yourself, Thomas.
Yeah, sorry, I do actually. In fact, you were my whole Zoom collapsed all of a sudden, and you were gone. You started freezing up, and I just heard very, yeah.
Okay, which point? Which point? Which point? This is not a point that a lot of people want to hear. So maybe.
So yes, sadly the broadcast went away, and I had to log in again. But here I'm back.
Okay, so basically I was talking about that the mediation that on one end, which is discussed in the world through institutions, the numbers are not there. So to say that is mediation, and the whole concept of taking it into various parts of a country or the world in general is colonization for me, only to the extent that you create a class distinction, that this is someone who is a mediator. The other person who's actually practicing it, who's actually giving people the user experience, no, you are not a mediator. You're an inferior person, which is what colonization was. I'm superior, you are inferior. And that's happening in relation to mediation, in that might not be really, in a way it's connected only to the extent that, yes, we should look at it from a broader perspective, the people who are going to be mediators, because if, again, when we talk about the transparency and the larger involvement, people whom people trust, finally it's about trust of people. Whom do we bring in as mediators so that there is more acceptance to that mediation? So that is where I'm wanting to move away from the institutionalized concept, and these are the mediators. Of course, you are certified and everything, that's another world. I'm on the other side. I'm on the fighting for the non-certified, the ones who need.
No, I noticed that. Yeah, I mean, it is ultimately, it is really an interesting question, because of course you get asked, about your accreditation. That's certainly something, in particular, when lawyers are involved, they want to see your accreditation. They want to know about your accreditation. That's a stamp of approval. That's of quality, not approval, but of quality. For them, I'm not sure whether it translates that simply. I'm sure there are very good mediators. I mean, I've seen negotiators, I'll be very frank with you, that they were superb, and they would also be superb mediators without any further accreditation course. But yeah, they would have, I think, in order to really make a living of it, they would probably need an accreditation course, because they would be asked every 5 seconds where you're accredited. And then you have the situation as well that you can call yourself accredited mediator in one jurisdiction where you are accredited, but you may not call yourself an accredited mediator in another jurisdiction. So because they have their own accreditation system, which technically is then the same, but because you haven't done it through the institution. And I think that's what you were alluding to. You need to be then institution affine and be with these institutions. It's a fragmentation of the market in a way, for sure. We see it in the legal market as well. It's the same thing in a way.
No, but why I'm connecting it to colonization is only because of the fact that this is a expertise or a skill that has nothing to do with training, nothing at all. And it's a skill which is something which people, yes, develop over time. And this is why that I have to keep talking about that evolution of a mediator series only started only because of this. that this is something that a person goes through for years of their life and makes them who they are. And to say that I will put you through this factory of 40 hours and make you a mediator, I'm like totally against that concept. You're fooling people. And when you talk about certification and people asking for it, it's a factory, it's an industry which has created, work hasn't happened for them. So you have got,
I mean, when I started out, when I started out, I mean, sorry, not even as a mediator, but when I got involved in mediation first, and in particular when I was involved in mediation again for the Australian government, I was a heavily facilitative mediation champion. I was like, no, hands off, completely hands off. Let the parties do. You just do very, around the edges, sort of a little bit massaging, a bit more, helping them to talk to each other and find their own solutions. Now, this has changed a little bit over time, I really have to say. I know, practicing it myself, it certainly, you develop as a mediator. It's not that you start somewhere and then you just stop and that's it. And you basically, what you've learned in your accreditation course is what you actually also will do for the next 30 years mediating. That's not because you learn what works and what doesn't. And so you evolve as a mediator for sure. There's no question about that. So I totally agree, and I completely agree with you as well, that I'm 100% sure, excellent mediators out there who have no accreditation whatsoever, but they are really good at what they're doing because it's experience. This is not something you can just learn like that, but it is something that you learn over time by doing it. That's really the substance of mediation.
But I'm trying to put why I keep emphasizing, and it's good for even, you say, mediation in the arts, in on these things which I've taken from a country. How do I connect it to the village? I'm saying that acceptance to a process comes from usage, and it is already being used. To be able to make it something which is done on a branded way. Okay, this is now mediation happening, it is actually happening. The acceptance of the process comes in. Once the acceptance of the process happens, when you say that you want to do it on a national issue, people understand, yes, this is something that works, and it is a good way of going about it to create that collaborative environment that people have used. Because once people who get into a mediation, the participants, they walk out as different people in relation to whatever, be it negotiation they will do. It might not be every time a mediation. They will change the way they do it. So let people experience it rather than confining it to a few. Because look, in a country that you come from, definitely the market is more mature. So there is a differentiation that is being created there. I'm saying we're talking about countries where you are going to educate the person about certification. The person doesn't know. Today, no one is going to ask you here, what certification do you have? Because it's not there. Sure, I'm saying should not even come in there, but it's not happening. But we will go and educate them. Oh, I am this. Oh, you are this. Then that person is not. So you are creating a distinction between them. On the other end, it's an industry where, of course, money is what I think. I don't know whether you've heard other sessions, but the people who have actually gone through the process and trained and certified and everything, on the other end, work hasn't come to them. I feel they've been misled. They've been misled as to, we'll make you a mediator kind of thing. So I just want them not to fall for that trap. Because Louis, you were saying, I don't know whether you said you heard a session there. She said, first of all, I did not have the money. I had to collect money to go for this certification, which for me, and after that, what did she get? You don't get work. She hasn't got work out of it. There's no work coming. It's just a misleading thing that industry misleads people to believe that they will fall into a category where work will come in, and it's huge amount of money for them. So I just want to stop that concept as soon as I can, and whatever little bit I can, because I'm saying that if you find people with that skill and take them forward without all these things in their mind that, oh, you need a certification to do it, if they can do that, you'll have so much more of it happening. Because there are, when I talk about disputes, you can understand how many disputes we have in a country like ours, and then of course lots of other countries. So 50 million disputes lying in the courts today, 18 million going in every year. 50 million they keep increasing, the backlog increases. So definitely not as many are coming out. So there is a huge market there, and it's good for mediation in general. because rather than clogging the court system with 50 million pending matters, if those can go out and they can actually be resolved because of the acceptance of the process, imagine how much that process will be used, and you will move from that whole colonized structure of the courts. So for that, because I'm telling you, whatever certifications and all are happening, what numbers can you create? I mean, how many people can you put through if you want to? Because no one questions who is training. Everyone talks about the certification. That's where the money is made. But who was the trainer? Was the trainer certified? Who's certifying the trainer? And finally, at the end of all these certifications, I was speaking to that Ivana from the IMI. She says, look, we go do all these mock mediations and everything. Finally, you want the user experience to be good. So that's why you do it. I am saying start with those people who already giving the user experience. You don't need to go through the process at all, because the people are telling you, oh, we trust this person. This one has been helping people in our area who resolve disputes. So your user experience concept taken care of. Beyond that, skill development will happen. We'll give them whatever needs to be. It's enough material is already available. More can come in. But I just think that we need to move from that. Why are we discussing this, Thomas? I'm moving you into a discussion which definitely is way beyond the area that you want to discuss. But this happens to be.
No, I was actually just reflecting on it because I'm going to teach mediation next week in Vienna again, and for a week. And I have conversations with students about what it's nowadays referred to going into mediation. You know, whatever you want to, whatever that is. And they have cottoned on to the fact that they need to be accredited. And they ask you these questions: with whom should I go? What is the best accreditation institution? Do I go with CEDA? Do I go with the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators? Do I go with who knows what? And in a way, I'll be very honest with you, I can't really answer that question. It's a question of how long is a piece of string. Sometimes I actually say, have a look at the price list and, make a decision on what you can afford, by the end of the day. It is a tricky issue, but it's certainly something that has trickled into the vernacular now. And certainly for students of the law, they are looking for the accreditation. That's the reality of it.
So Thomas, look, I quote a figure that was given by Andrew Miller in last year's symposium on mediation in our culture and traditions. 18,000 certified mediators in the UK, only 500 have work. That's what he put out. And I will take his figures.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, so I will take his figure because he's a senior mediator and he will know the market. So 17,500 people have been put through an industry with this whole. I mean, you've sold a dream to them. We'll make you a mediator. So I'm saying stop doing that. Tell them that you want to tell them about handling disputes or conflicts. Of course, I'm totally focused on disputes, but of course, larger conflicts, conflict management, and all those things. But don't say I will make you a mediator, because you're fooling them. You're telling them I'm putting you into a path where you are going to get work, because that is what the person is looking at. If they're looking at generally handling their life and conflicts, put it under that brand. That's not a problem. Whatever name you want to give it, but as long as you don't say this, because I'm telling you, the moment you said you make them something, it means you've put them into a position where definitely some work is going to come to them. I would expect if that should be their expectation. If it's not, then I don't know what they've gone into that certification for. So that is the hope. So I've been telling people, I mean, young people ask me, oh, we want to in some way, in whatever, I mean, way, shadow you or whatever. All I tell them is, instead, go out, talk to people who have a dispute, say that, yes, let's do mediation. And if you feel that, yes, you need to bring me in or some other senior person, be a co-mediator, because you have a lot to add to that process. Don't think that this is a process where a senior person adds more than you. Maybe you might add more, because this skill is not a skill which is based on your being about. I'm saying that, okay, my white hair is going to help. It helps in certain communities, definitely. But if you have the skill and you can handle it, handle it. come to a senior only if you feel that certain, like keep saying, this is the model that I'm creating, that for as a sounding board, as something to give comfort to people, but just go out and say that, look, let's use mediation, and if you credibility, a senior brings in credibility, okay, Thomas has this experience, we'll bring him in whenever we need to, but we don't have to pay for his entire time. This junior can handle a lot of things, and then you come in. That's the model that I want to push through, because they're going through this mock. One is they're going through this mock mediation. You don't play act. This is emotions. This is a real thing happening. Disputes are real things. You don't play act these things. It doesn't work that way. These are real things. And on the other end, they are not getting a chance to work, because they are looking at some point of time when they will reach a situation where they can actually go out and get work, which is not going to come to them. So I'm saying you create work, go out and say yes, and don't even say that you don't need a certification. Anyone you say that you will want to assist them, and this is a process they should use, they have nothing to lose. If you tell them that they're into a process where they can walk out anytime, it's not. And look, and some people try to say that no, this is the credibility is added by certification. I'm saying that trust comes from person to the person creates a trust with someone. Certifications don't create that trust. They just talking to a person, and these are two participants. I mean, there might be multi participants, but two participants gauging one individual. It's like two-factor authentication that you have in security these days in on your system. It's like that. Two people have said, yes, we trust this person. That's all that's required, and they'll find that right person, and that's all that we need.
It's very true, but I think that is obviously the entry point for the accreditation in a way, because it's often accreditation is equated to quality assurance. And so if you say this person comes from that accreditation regime, having done the relevant trainings, then this person is of a certain quality standard, if I may put it this way. And with that, you also have already this first level of trust. They know you're coming from there, you are trained in that way, etc. If you don't have it, then this trust needs to be gained, or that first step of trust needs to be gained in a different way. So this is outward facing trust building in a way. Does it work?
It hasn't worked up to now, Thomas. It hasn't worked over these years.
It's not complete. I mean, it's not a given.
No, it's not happening. When you talk about any part of the world, work hasn't come to mediators. Full-time mediators, not happening. Thomas is an arbitrator mediator. He's not a mediator only. So it's not happening anywhere. So there is. But I have arbitrations like as a counsel as well. So
Yeah.
So I'm saying if Thomas or people who can work full-time as full-time mediators, that's when I know the process is accepted, and it is actually something which people are using, because finally, of course, it's the mindset. And once a person has a mediator mindset, I can't sit as an arbitrator. I just can't do it. Even when practicing as a lawyer in an arbitration, I have as a counsel for someone, I have made sure that they settle it between themselves. And so you go with that mindset. So for me to even with the mindset of a mediator to sit as an arbitrator, I just find that totally different worlds. But people have to do it because one is because of livelihood. They need to do it because there is passion on the mediation side. There's money on the A word side. So for that reason. But I'm saying that if in all these years we haven't reached there, let's relook it. I know that industry will function, and that by my saying so, it's not going to stop functioning. People are going to be fooled into it. They'll come in, they'll get disillusioned, a new law. It's a Ponzi scheme. It'll continue because there's not an issue. Then enough young people out there who think that anyone's looking for some work to do. Okay, they think, and for each person is paying a lot of money, but it's not something, if they walk out of it, it's not the end of the world for a lot of them. So they'll go through the process. Look, I've talked to frustrated people. I talk to them. They're so frustrated.
And they're looking for the edge. They're looking for the edge. There's so many lawyers pouring out of universities, and including into the arbitration world, of course. And so they're looking for the edge, and that's still that accreditation as a mediator can still set you apart from the rest of the law graduates that are vying for jobs on the job market. It is potentially something that can still distinguish yourself from the other students or from the other graduates that move up. So it is a tricky issue. I mean, I have to say when students ask me that, as I said, I'm hard pressed. I certainly struggle to say you absolutely have to do this accreditation and do it now. It's entirely possible to do it down the track and develop skills, because the skills themselves, that's not a question of accreditation. That the skills can be acquired otherwise. Much of it, personally, I think is common sense. But how you actually use them in a mediation, you could train otherwise without it. And that skills, even if you practice as a lawyer, I think are superb skills to have. There's no question about that. And then if you one day want to do an accreditation, you can still do it down the track. But that's not the reality. At least that's not the reality as I hear it from the students. They very strongly feel that they need to go down the path of getting their accreditation. So in a way, I think the marketing has worked.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you what the thing is. There's no transparency there. All I'm saying is, even the institution that you're talking about, Saya, whatever, and others, let them put out figures. Let them go out, and all the people who've been certified by them, take figures from them in their entire time since they were certified. This year they were certified. How many matters did they get for mediation? Let the whole list be out there for the young person to see and to know whether this is something which finally, if it is a passion where you want to do, there's enough opportunity without certifications. There are enough people with disputes that you can help. If you think this can give you work, it will be all in front of you. There's no confidentiality in Thomas saying that I have done so many mediations. People, okay, what you did in that mediation might be confidential. You're putting out numbers, but not now.
But because by the end of the day, I mean, this is what potential parties ask you to submit anyway. They want to see a sheet of the kind of things that you have done in the past. So yeah, there is actually it has the name arbitration in its name. That's the National Arbitration Institute of the Netherlands, the NII, and they actually disclose on their website the mediators and arbitrators that they have selected, or parties have selected, for cases that were administrated by the NII. And that's actually very interesting, because you can actually see how many arbitrations were there, how many sole arbitrators, how many panels, who was on the panel, and you can also see the mediators. And it is by far more arbitration than mediation, that's for sure.
And in terms of numbers, how many mediations have happened? Have you have some idea?
I have no idea. I don't have the figures with me.
So I'd say what you can tell young people, because they definitely will look at you to advise them. Tell them to write to all these institutions and ask for numbers, and how many matters came into these institutions and how many went for mediation in terms of numbers. In value, yes, it'll be nice if they put value to how much for the value. Maybe that's a good thing. But I'm saying even numbers come in so that they know, okay, how many people are certified and how much work came in. So per person, let's come out with some average, because I looked at the JAMS figures. So JAMS is supposed to be one of the largest. Some they say the largest. Whether that's true or not, I don't want to get into. But in the entire year, 9,000 mediations. That's it. In the entire year for the largest institution of mediation. They say that they have 400 neutrals on their panel. So I'm just saying that if an institution like that can have only 9,000 matters, think of what the numbers in others are and how many certifications on the other end have happened. Look at all those figures and then ask yourself whether that is going to be your route. If you want work, if you want to do mediations, you don't need anything. You are educating people, saying that you have a certification which they don't know about, and they will question you also. okay, if you are like that, who are the other people who are certified? Let's look at all those people. That's a chain which is never ending. It's about, I trust me, I will help you. And in terms of fees, I've been saying that, tell them you can pay what you want if you want to learn, because here you're paying so much to go get a certification. Here you'll get an actual mediation to do. And there's no other learning than actually doing a mediation. There's no other learning. Everything else is a play that you are part of. Here, this is it. And you have enough disputes to do that. So I've been telling the younger people this is the route to take. Talk to your family, talk to your community, anywhere. Is there a dispute that you have? Let me help you. If, and I have this person, I know Thomas, if there is something that we can bring him in, they can have a meeting with you, so that, okay, he's available, but his cost is so much, we don't have to go to him all the time. I will handle these. We'll get him involved when it wants. So it adds to your work, because they're out there doing, say, 100 meetings and come to you for one. In similarly, you'll have 100 of these people out there. Each of them comes to you that one meeting. That's good enough for you. So that's how the chain gets expanded, and lots of more work happens. People experience mediation. They're still connected to Thomas. So they've experienced what you bring in, but at the other end, these young people can bring a lot. I feel, I mean, look, when I started my practice, my senior was like the best, I would say. I was treated like even I was a student, and I was used to work in the law firm, because luckily in our university, we could do evening classes. We had that option. So I was working full time in the law firm, and he treated me like a lawyer. I mean, I was doing more work with him than lawyers were, because what you bring into the profession is what you are and what your skills are. Don't fall for the trap that, oh, I mean, you have to become a lawyer, then so many years of experience. I hear a lot of lawyers tell the younger people, so many years, you can forget about anything, you are not going to get any work. And here I was, day one, I was doing things. So I think it's just, we have to not tell these people that they know everything. The skill is there.
It's what you know, and it's you.
Yeah. And the skill, they have the skill. I'm saying, I've been trying to say this because your value system, for me, that mediation is a little different mediation. It's not the deal making through the court system, which I was trying to tell Armando, that the fact that you're settling because of the cost and the time, which if you're looking at Germany, you'll have to tell me, because in the last symposium, Chuck, who's working in Germany, but he's from Israel, he said Germany, the court system is very efficient, so mediation did not develop there. So that means the efficiency of the court system should be what you should be looking at if you want to improve. I mean, you don't want backlog, but mediation to be connected to that, I think that's a wrong connection being made. So
yeah, I mean, we talked briefly. I made some comments about that briefly when Armando was there. I think that's probably true. This is certainly an experience that I had here, that the argument that lawyers bring to the table in terms of mediation is not really something our clients need, because the courts are fast enough and they're technically cheaper because the filing is lower than the mediation costs. That I'm not 100% sure that's probably not true in all circumstances, but they're obviously afraid that they have to pay twice, for the mediation, and the mediation is not successful, and then they have again pay for the actual filing. So they file and then they go through the courts, and that's possible because in the Netherlands, here in Germany, of course, the court system is rather efficient and works well, but it is the control that you hand over. That's for me always one of the issues. Do you want to have someone you don't know deciding your matter on a legal basis, or do you want to stay in control and actually get an outcome that suits your needs and your interests? Exactly. And I think they're two different things. It's not necessarily just pinned to the efficiency of a court. Of course, if you efficiency of the court, then I think the comparison needs to be done between arbitration and litigation. Then you would be more comparing systems, and of course, in international context, often efficiency of courts is one argument in favor of arbitration. But in the reverse shouldn't then work in jurisdictions where a court system actually is efficient, and yet we have in Germany and in the Netherlands quite a bit of activity in the arbitration field. So, and I think they're fulfilling different purposes, these dispute resolution processes, and it's ultimately a strategic choice as to what you want to do. But it's not a question of efficiency or money, but it is actually what you actually are looking for. You know, do you want to destroy an efficient, a profitable, healthy relationship between two businesses, or do you want to maintain it? That's your choice, you know. And I think that's more the focus.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I've been saying, that is where we need to focus on. That tell people that you are using this process because you want to collaborate, because relationship comes in. Let's start from that, which is why I did not get into it in Armando's session about the mandatory mediation part of it, because that's a huge discussion by itself, because you're creating an environment which is a colonized environment, that dispute resolution happens in courts. This you'll have to disconnect it if you want mediation to develop. If you just want your backlog to go away, and for that reason you are promoting this mandatory mediation part, you might be successful. Why not? There will be matters you'll force people to do it, and they'll settle it because you are inefficient. This is when I'm talking about the inefficiency of the courts. If your courts are efficient, people, because of the colonized mindset, want someone else to take a decision for them. That is what that whole mindset is, which we need to change, which is where the whole work has to happen on that end. But if that is the mindset that people have, and that's why they've come to the court, you have a duty to do that. You have to be efficient, and to work around this inefficiency and taking advantage of it, that okay, I'm going to be inefficient, but I will push you through another process which you did not come to me for. I think that those are debates that need to happen, because I am saying in countries where I don't say infrastructure should be a problem. Appointing judges should not be a problem. I mean, you can definitely spend on those things. So create that. If people want that, there should be an option. Arbitration, definitely. I mean, in certain countries like India, hasn't really worked the way it should have. People have gone back challenging the arbitral awards. That's been stuck in courts. So litigation the court system has finished off litigation. Obviously 14 years average time, finished off arbitration because everything came back to the courts, so that they also get stuck there. Now mediation is going to be, they're now destroying mediation. That's where the colonial structure comes in.
I was just about to say, on that logic, I would be very interested to hear you on the Singapore Convention, because ultimately you get a legalification, if I may call it that way, of this process, in the sense that you have the enforcement mechanism ultimately, and it is entirely possible that you will actually end up seeing something very similar happening as well at the.
So, Thomas, let me tell you that you are looking at the Singapore Convention. We already have the best law on mediation, which is called conciliation. Have a look at it. The settlement agreement is as good as a consent award, which is as good as a court decree. The only thing is, it's been, because it's a consent award, as good as a consent award, because it's part of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Because at that time they looked at that route only for the reason that what are those situations where the court can actually refuse enforcement. You had to have some criteria. Today, the Singapore Convention has given you some criteria. You can put that criteria, so the settlement agreement becomes as good as a court decree directly. It doesn't matter. The main thing is we have everything available. Even then, people are misled to believe you don't have a structure available, and
you have the same in mediation. I have certainly discussed it with colleagues. I personally haven't done it yet, but would be completely open to do it. For me, this is actually making an awful lot of sense, where you agree up front that the mediated settlement agreement is turned to an arbitral award and will become enforceable under the New York Convention. That is a very, a consent-based award.
Challenge, Thomas. Challenge. You have to be very careful there, because a settlement agreement, once is entered into, after that, you cannot start the process of arbitration because the settlement there is nothing to arbitrate. So I think some people are so in India, what we have is a very good thing, which is 1996, we have got the whole MEDA thing available in our law. So the law says that, if of course it says that it's the duty of the arbitrator to see if they can settle it, which I think is a duty, but the fact is they can settle through mediation or conciliation. That's the interesting thing that I've been trying to tell people, that both those things have to be there. Here today it is, let's have a law on mediation. They keep talking about it. I'm saying you're in an arbitration, you have two routes available. I want to stay in the arbitration, I want to go out of the arbitration. If I want to stay in the arbitration, it's called mediation, and you come back to the arbitrator, passes a consent award, which goes under the New York Convention. I do not want to stay in the arbitration. I go out into conciliation, which we have a section on conciliation in that act. It is now, it's a standalone section. You go under that. That settlement agreement is as good as a consent award. You don't have to go to an arbitrator. It becomes a court decree directly. So if you imagine, in 1996, we have had this system in the law available to us. And even today, people are getting confused. They're confusing people. We don't have a law. I'm saying no better structure in the world is available, because even in the court system, we have a civil procedure code where both the words are used. And I'm saying it requires to be used, because if you want to stay in the court, you use mediation and come back to the court passes a decree. But if you want to go out of the court system, you have a standalone law on conciliation. Use that law, get a settlement agreement. You don't have to come back to court, because I'll tell you, people are not understanding the long term of. Let's connect it to the Singapore Convention.
But that's what I'm saying. There are ways.
I'll tell you why. Why I want to put this across, because you'll be doing this work. If you do not understand this aspect, people don't understand this aspect of a separate conciliation part of it. The mediation which happens, and if you go to court and get a court decree, you cannot enforce it under the Singapore Convention. So it is better for people to go out into conciliation, get that under conciliation, which by itself then you can use under the Singapore Convention. So this is where you have an option available, because people want a court decree. Perfect. You've got a settlement agreement which is as good as a court decree. You can enforce it as a court decree in your country, in India, and you can enforce it under the settlement agreement somewhere else under the Singapore Convention. So you have that option available. I mean, it's a structure which is very nicely put out there, which is where people are confusing people.
But again, we're talking about options, and some of the options are not that well known. That's the other thing, that they're actually available. So that's why you then have this funneling into particular channels of dispute resolution channels, because the information is, not that well known, not widely known. I think that's still unfortunately the case.
I have taken a lot of your time. So Thomas, one concluding kind of remark or whatever you want to give, please conclude. And then I know you're being polite. You're polite and not being able to say, no, I want to get out of it.
No. I look up, to be very honest. As I said, there's so many things that we can talk about, and that are really fascinating and really interesting. And I think really the only thing that I want to say is, Vikram, first of all, thank you for your time, that you make your time available. I know it's a little bit later where you are, so it's absolutely fantastic that you're still around, that we had that conversation, taking it obviously way beyond cultural objects and art objects that were looted, stolen, taken away during colonial times, and are now in the painful process of being returned. But I think more importantly, I really want to thank you for actually putting on this series of events, of these symposia that you created, because I think they make really an impact, in the sense that people pay attention to them, that they actually start looking at the issue, that you draw attention to the fact that there is mediation out there as a real alternative today. And this is the kind of effort, this is the kind of promotional effort in a way as well, but also obviously effort in the sense that it kickstarts conversation amongst the mediators, amongst the community, about issues. And I think you really need to be commended for that. That is a really terrific initiative that you have taken there, and I'm exceedingly grateful that you've done that, and very humbled by the fact that I could actually be part of this today. So thank you so much for that.
And Thomas,
that note,
very nice, kind words of yours. It feels nice to be appreciated. It does.
Thank you so much.
Look, I'm telling you, these conversations, like you said, is just to have those discussions so that people can take those further discussions. Because look, it's been 5 hours continuously that I've sat here because we've had those sessions. And
you've done very well.
But although I did ask my wife to give me something to eat while you were talking, I'm sure you saw me munching or something. That little bit I needed. But I'm just saying that these conversations, I just feel we're getting somewhere because of the response that I get. Because somewhere, someone, if just gets inspired by what Thomas says, even that one sentence changes that person's life. That's job done. We don't have to change the billions of people on the planet. It's that one person. So that's been really nice. So thank you very much for taking out time. It's really nice.
You're very welcome. Anytime.
And please come on the last day of the symposium for the learnings and key takeaways. Even for some time, just drop in. So thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much, Vikram, and anytime, and hopefully soon again.
Yeah. Bye. Thanks.